There we go. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with this. So we have some dimensions to work from. Again, we're working with a 100 by 100 by 60 feet. So we really only need to stay within two of those values. So we can start off by drawing a 100-foot curve. So I'm going to just zoom in here, hit 100, and click out to make way 100 foot. I can get rid of that for now. So I just have a simple 100-foot long curve. If I were to turn on the points, we can see that there's really just 2 points, one at either end. We can't really do much. I mean, I could take that point and lift it to lift the curve, but if I want to create some kind of interesting landform using profile curves, I'm going to need some more points that are making up this curve. So it's kind of like what we were just talking about with the grasshopper modeling, but done through Rhino. So I can select my curve, type rebuild, and here I'm going to say, so point count 10, degree 3. That might be a good starting point. Let's go ahead and just stick with that. So now we'll have 10 points. If I hit preview, oops, and hit OK. Now when I turn the points on over here, you can see I have a lot more points that I can work with. I'm not going to manipulate them yet. I'm going to go ahead and do that. And it's up to you to determine how many profile curves you want to use. The more you use, the more detailed you can make this. It's also going to require more time to refine each one of those. So it might be good just to start off every 10 feet. So I can select this, type array, number in the X direction, 1, in the Y direction, 10, Z, 1. Now I can just say every 10 feet, I think it'll work. There we go. So now we have our curves that we can start to create each one. And we can see that if I go ahead and select them all and turn on all the points, I can do it like that. So the idea is that you can just start to create a series of them, start moving them to do whatever it is you are inspired and interested in. So the idea behind this is that it's fairly simple to do, first off, but then it almost gives you an immediate feedback of what it's going to look like. So you can almost already tell just by looking at this what that landform is going to look like. So you have probably a lot of control over it from this perspective. However, the detail may be a little bit more difficult or require a little bit more time to, in fact, change. So the idea is that you can still manipulate these curves. What's nice too is that, let's turn these on. I was just moving them in the z-axis. That doesn't mean you only can move them in the z-axis. Maybe you want to eventually take one of these curves, maybe lift it a little bit more and start to create some kind of undercut. So in some of your examples, I'm sure you started to come across ideas of erosion or deposition where streams or rivers start to cut away at the banks of some kind of landform. So you can even start to imitate that idea through your case study. So we can see how we can even begin to move those points along the x-axis as well. And This is really as far as I'm going to go in Rhino. Now I'll bring up Grasshopper. I'm going to select my curves. I'll make sure to select them in sequential order, because if you don't, when you loft this, it'll do it out of order and it'll create something pretty obscure. It might be cool, but it might be horrendous. So I'm going to go ahead and go to my parameters, curves, set multiple curves, and now they're all referenced. Now I can just go over to surface and do that. So now I can see, for whatever reason, it does them out of order. So that's kind of odd. Let's try and reorder that. Let's try it this way. So set multiple curves. There we go. That, I don't know why that worked, but anyway, so what's cool about this is, like I said, you have a little bit more control over how you create your landform. And what's great is that you can still, like, I can turn this off so I can see my curve still. And because it's still generating the surface through Grasshopper, I can turn on my points still, manipulate them, and have the surface respond to it. So you can start to say, like, you know what, I really want this type of condition to exist. So let me maneuver it a little bit more over that. So that's kind of cool. Um, so, like I said, that's one technique in which you can create your landform, is through a series of profile curves. You can start off with, maybe another way to do that is that you can take, let's go ahead and go to our front view here. You could also create the curve more fluidly, like this. So you can say, here's one of my profile curves. I don't know if that's 100 feet. It doesn't look like it. But anyways, I can. So let's. And then start another one at the other end. So. And then maybe you want this profile curve to do something more like that. Oops, and that's totally off, isn't it? Let's try that again. Nope, I don't want project. I don't know why it keeps wanting. May have to just do a little. Oh, it's still wanting to go in all sorts of weird directions. Oh, well, you could always just make a copy of this. So I'll take this one, I'll do the same thing, I'll turn these points on. It's almost looking too much like the other one, but oh well. And something else you can do is you can select your two end curves, type tween curves, enter the number you want in between of that. So we can say 8. And that'll interpolate those curves in between. And then if you wanted to have a different desired outcome, you can always turn those points on and manipulate them to give it a little bit slightly different change. And then you can do the same thing. So then you have that, and then you can manipulate it from there. Okay. So that's one approach that you can generate your landform, is that you may have an idea of how you want the start of your profile of that landform to start and how it ends, and then begin to manipulate it in between. Okay, so that's a perfectly acceptable way to create your landform. Any other questions for this one? No, pretty straightforward. It's one of the simpler ones. I mean, you can see how advanced the script is right here. Make sure to take notes and watch tutorials on this one. All right, so let's jump into the next one. And even this next one probably isn't that different from what you've done previously using an image height field. So in this case, I'm going to create a flat surface where the dimensions are 100 by 100. Let me go ahead and reference this surface. I'm going to go ahead and hide this for now. And now I'm going to divide the surface. And it's up to you on how much you want to divide it. You can do it anywhere between 10 and 50 or more or less than that. I'll stick with maybe around 30 or so. Okay, so again, kind of a refresher course, but from this, we can use an image to essentially tell the points to go higher or lower. And on this example, I'll touch more on how you can do the more interesting interpolation of these data values that I was describing in the presentation earlier. And hopefully this makes it a little bit more tangible for you all. So whenever you run this script, this is kind of like what I was talking about before. All these points, it appears that it's just a nice grid of points, right? But the points are actually in branches. So here you can see there's 3 zeros, meaning it's branched out. There's the next one. And to help kind of clarify what these branches of points are doing, if you go to curve and choose, I guess interpolate's fine, and drag this in, and I'll turn this off, you can see that those points are essentially going in this direction. So that's how those points are divided. So that first data tree is all those points. The next data tree is the other points. Another cool thing, if you want to see or essentially invert this data tree, if you go to sets, tree, do flip matrix, and drag this into there, now they'll go the other direction. So that's a good technique to know whenever you're trying to organize your data. So again, that's just kind of a visualization of what those data trees mean. Does that give a little bit better sense of what data trees are? So In this case, I don't want to manipulate each branch of this data points. I just want to manipulate them all the same way. So I'm going to go ahead and flatten this. So now you'll see they're all 961 points. So what I'm going to do is go back over to parameters, input, and I'm going to now select the image sampler. I'll drag my points into here. Go ahead and double click in here to find an image. So I've already got a couple chosen. So for this, you can see that I'm not going to even use images that look like a landform. I'm going to highly suggest that if you take this approach, that you find an abstract image. It's as simple as just going to Google, type abstract texture, and find something that interests you. What's great about this technique too is that you can get maybe a dozen images and pretty quickly investigate how each image is going to alter this grid of points. This one's pretty cool, so let's go ahead and select that. And what we need to do now is that we know this is a grid of points that's domain is 0 to 100. So we need to change it from being 0 to 1 to 0 to 100, because that's just the dimensions of that surface. And instead of looking at this as a colored image, we want to actually look at it as a black and white image, because the way the height fields work, as hopefully some of you guys remember, the white values usually represent a high value, and then the darkers represent a low value. So in this case, a pure white is 1, and then a pure black is 0. That helps with how we see this data. So I'm going to go ahead and select this one all the way at the end, hit OK. You can see now the image is black and white. And just to clarify on this, you can see now essentially all, how many are there? 961 points. All 961 points have a grayscale color value. So these ones are pretty close to 0 or a pure black. And then you have some that are 0.87. That's pretty close to a white. If I were to double click on this and if I were to just keep it in its original color, you can see that it gets separated by these commas or RGB values. You can use that data to alter it. So if you said like, oh, wherever there's a lot of reds, I want those to react differently. It's certainly something you can do. I mean, you can even change it here, where now instead of them being separated by comma, you can see what their red values are. That could be an interesting. So it doesn't even have to just be black and white. But for the purposes of keeping this simple, I'm going to stick with that. So like I said, these all have a gray scale value. This is the data information, right? So it's what we do with this information that begins to give parameters to our 3D manipulation. So go ahead and get rid of that. And essentially what I want to do is say, based off of its grayscale value, I'm going to move those points along the y-axis or give them a height. So the lower the value or the darker, the closer it is going to be to its existing plane, versus the white values or those gray values will begin to move up from there. So I'm going to go ahead and type move, drag these points in here. I'll double click, hit Z for the unit Z. I'll drag that in here. And because these values are so low, they're between 0 and 1, even when I drag that in there, these height changes aren't going to be really significant. You can see they're just barely being lifted up there. You could exaggerate that pretty easily by just using a multiplier. So if I were to go to math, multiplication, take these values, and then maybe just multiply them between either like do a 10 to 50 slider to multiply it by a range. So now you can see the points are starting to get lifted up a little bit more. And let's go ahead and turn that off. And now from these grid of points, I can create a surface. So I'll go to surface from points, drag the new geometry into here. And then it also needs this U count value. This is where it's a little confusing. So keep note of this. So this divides that surface into essentially, in this case, 30 sections or 30 segments. This needs to know how many points. So whenever you're creating a surface from a grid, and it's from some kind of point count, it's always going to be whatever this value. So when I drag that in there, it turns red. It means you screwed up, and it's not going to function. Go ahead and right click on this, go to expression, and do x, so whatever that value that's being inputted, x plus 1. Because that slider value represents the segments. This one needs to know the points of each segment. So this kind of goes back to that cross-section question. If I were to take a curve and divide it into 10 segments, how many points are there going to be? 11, right? Because there's a point at the very beginning, there's going to be 9 in between, and then 1 at the very end. So you always need to add just one extra value. Hit commit changes, and now you can see you have an actual surface that's been manipulated from that grid of points. It's already kind of starting to take on that kind of ridge and valley values. So you can use this multiplier to exaggerate it a little bit more. But again, what this multiplier is doing is it's only just exaggerating those values in a very linear fashion. It's just simply multiplying each one of those values by whatever the slider value is. So drop it to 30. So what happens if you want either the white values to be more defined, or maybe you want to make even the darker values have a little more substance to it? This is one of those cases where you need to reinterpolate or regraph that data. And it's pretty simple to do. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. So like I said, instead of there being so much low values, so there's still a lot of points that are really close to that ground, and maybe I want there to be a couple more ridge lines that occur in there, I can regraph it to do just that. So I'm going to go back to parameters, choose graph mapper. I'm going to drag this value into here. I'll go ahead and get rid of this and this. I'll right click it, go down to graph types. And for this one, I'll just stick with the Bezier. So this is kind of a nice graph showing that very linear interpolation. So what it all means is that if that value is 0.1, like if it's a 10% gray, essentially, it's only going to move up 0.1 feet. If it's a pure white of 1, it moves up 1 feet. Does that all make sense? So you can see it's just a nice linear interpolation. If I double click on this, I can begin to adjust those values. So again, the x0 and x1 is just your x-axis. So this is all the data that's being input into the graph. It's nice because using that grayscale image here, we know that all those values are between 0 and 1. So nothing really changes with this. So we have 0 to 1. So here's your 0 gray value of uh, 0, and then your y value of 1. What you can essentially say is that instead of your whites only going up 1 feet, I can already start to manipulate this to be 45 feet. So I'll hit OK. And then keep that the same. And all that's even going to do is exaggerate. It's really just the multiplier. But if I want to adjust that, I can start to grab these handles over here and begin to give it a little bit more dimension. So I can make it really flat. So all those values that are even maybe 0.2 or 0.3 are still going to be really low on the y-axis or its height change. So you can make it do something more like that. Or you can even make it more of this kind of concave shapes. And now there's a lot of ridge lines that are happening on this. And you don't even have to, you can start to do that. So this is really what the graph mapper does, is that it reinterpolates that data based off of whatever this curve is looking like. So you can almost say that everything in the 50% gray is going to plateau out, and then only the whites are going to get really tall. So that almost, it goes from, this almost looks more like a plateau or butte to looking like a pretty rough ridge line. Then I can even change this. So you can even say maybe all those gray values are what's going to get tall instead. So the black and white values are going to stay low, but then the grays are going to take on a different shape. So there's all sorts of cool ways in which you can do this. You can even just purely invert it all. So now the darker values are what's going to be tall. So you can kind of see here, here's that white streak that's going along here. Those are all now low. And then those darker values become higher. Now it's more like a canyon. It's kind of interesting. And like I said, what's nice about this too is that, again, pretty simple script. And what's great about it is, like I said, you could download 12 images, crop them to just be a nice 1-to-1 ratio, double click in here, change your image. And now it's created a new surface based off of this image. This one doesn't work as well as I had thought it would have, but still interesting. Having a different grid value is also going to change how it appears. So I know, again, you guys did this in your advanced digital media class, so I'm sure you guys can even come up with more creative ideas, but here's a good starting point. So I'll just